That morning, my sister marched into the office wearing her usual triumphant smirk, only to freeze dead in her tracks. My desk was entirely bare. Yet what silenced the conference room wasn't my absence, but the email I had scheduled to send at 8 in the morning. When the general counsel whispered a desperate prayer that I hadn't copied the entire board, I knew my family had ignited a fire they could never extinguish. My name is Piper Thomas, and up until 5 minutes ago, I was the Chief Operating Officer of Thomas Ridge Holdings. I am 33 years old, and I have spent the last decade of my life turning the chaotic, ego-driven impulses of my father and sister into a functional, profitable reality. The conference room was cold, a deliberate design choice my father, Richard Thomas, insisted upon to keep meetings efficient. The air conditioning hummed a low, aggressive drone that usually drowned out the sound of nervous breathing. Today, however, the silence in the room was heavy enough to crush a lung. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, my hand resting on the clicker for the presentation screen. Behind me, the projected quarterly review glowed in harsh blue light. The numbers were not kind. They were not malicious either. They were simply facts. And in my family, facts were often treated as personal insults. We are currently projected to miss the delivery window for the Vanguard contract by 6 weeks, I said, keeping my voice level. My eyes scanned the room, avoiding the faces of the junior executives who were looking down at their notepads, terrified to witness a family brawl. I looked directly at my father at the head of the table, and then at my sister, Lila, who sat at his right hand. Lila sighed loudly, a theatrical sound that grated on my nerves. She leaned back in her leather chair, twirling a strand of her blonde hair. She looked immaculate, as always. She was the face of the company, the head of client relations, the one who took the clients out for $5,000 dinners and promised them the moon. I was the one who had to figure out how to build the moon with a budget of $10 and a box of scraps. "You are being dramatic." "Piper," Lila said, waving a manicured hand at the screen, "we are not going to miss the deadline. I spoke to the client yesterday. They are thrilled with our progress. They are thrilled with the fantasy you sold them." "Lila," I replied, my tone hardening. I pulled up the next slide. It showed a timeline chart, marked with angry red blocks indicating supply chain failures. The structural steel delivery is delayed. The permit for the expansion was filed incorrectly 3 months ago. We physically cannot build the facility by the 1st of November. It is a mathematical impossibility. If we do not adjust their expectations now, we trigger the penalty clause, that is $50,000 a day in fines. Richard cleared his throat. It was a deep, rumbling sound that usually signaled the end of a debate. He did not look at the screen. He looked at me. His eyes narrowed behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Piper, you are letting the logistics bog you down," my father said. His voice was patronizing, the tone one uses with a child who is afraid of the dark. "Lila has a rapport with Vanguard. If we tell them we are late now, we look incompetent. We push through, we make it happen. That is the Thomas Ridge way." I felt a muscle in my jaw jump. The Thomas Ridge way usually involved me working 80-hour weeks to cover up their mistakes. But not this time. This was not a minor shipping error. This was legally actionable negligence. "It is not about bogging down, Dad," I said. "It is about fraud. We signed a contract stating we had secured the permits. We have not." Lila told them the steel was on site. "It is currently sitting in a shipping container in the middle of the Pacific Ocean." Lila slammed her hand on the table. "Stop trying to sabotage me," she shrieked. Her composure cracked, revealing the spoiled malice underneath. "You are just jealous because I landed the biggest contract in the company history. You are trying to make me look bad in front of the board." "I am trying to keep us from getting sued for breach of contract," I countered, "and it is too late to debate the strategy. I already handled it." The room went deadly silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Richard slowly placed his coffee cup down on the saucer. The china clicked sharply against the glass. "What did you do?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "I sent an email to the Vanguard legal team and their project lead at 8 this morning. I stated, meeting his gaze without flinching. I informed them of the permit delay and provided a revised, realistic timeline for completion. I also attached the updated supply chain report so they can see we are being transparent. I framed it as a proactive measure to ensure quality control. For a moment, nobody moved. The junior executives seemed to be trying to merge with their chairs. "You what?" Lila whispered, her face turning a blotchy red. "You told them we lied?" "I told them the truth before they found out the lie on their own. I corrected, and they will find out. Their inspectors are due to visit the site in 4 days. If they arrived and saw an empty lot where a foundation is supposed to be, they would have canceled the contract immediately and sued us for damages. I saved the account." "Lila." "You went behind my back," Lila spat out, turning to our father. "Daddy, she humiliated me. She went over my head to my client. She is trying to steal the relationship. She has no respect for me." Richard stood up. He was a tall man, imposing, and he used his physical presence as a weapon. He walked over to the window, looking out at the city skyline, then turned back to face me. His face was cold, stripped of any paternal warmth. "You had no right. Piper," he said. "I have every right," I argued, my voice rising slightly. "I am the chief operating officer. Operations were compromised. I made an executive decision to mitigate risk." "You undermined your sister," Richard roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You undermined this family. You do not send unauthorized communications to key clients. You do not air our dirty laundry. You made us look weak." "I made us look honest," I shot back. "Honesty does not pay the bills. Relationships pay the bills," Richard yelled. "Lila is the lead on this. You support her. That is your job. Your only job is to make sure she succeeds. And instead, you cut her legs out from under her." Lila was sniffing now, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. "I work so hard," she whimpered. "I try to build this legacy, and she just wants to tear it down because she is bitter. She is so toxic. Daddy, it is impossible to work with her." I stared at them. It was a tableau I had seen 1,000 times. The weeping princess and the dragon of a father, and me, the knight who had actually slain the monster, being blamed for getting blood on the carpet. "I saved the company $2 million in potential litigation costs this morning," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. "You should be thanking me." "Thank you?" Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You want me to thank you for insubordination? You have grown arrogant, Piper. You think because you know the numbers, you run this place, you forget whose name is on the building." I looked at the nameplate on the door. Thomas Ridge. It was my name too. But clearly, some Thomases were more equal than others. "I want an apology," Lila said, her voice dripping with sudden venomous strength. She looked at me with a smirk she didn't bother to hide from our father. "I want her to apologize to me, in front of everyone here, for damaging my reputation with the client. And I want her to send a retraction email saying she was mistaken." I looked at her. Retracting the truth would not only make me look like an idiot, it would constitute actual fraud now that the facts were on record. "I will not do that," I said. Richard walked back to the head of the table. He leaned forward, placing his knuckles on the wood. "Then you leave me no choice," he said. He looked around the room, ensuring he had an audience for his display of power. He wanted to break me. He wanted to show everyone that no matter how competent I was still subject to his rule. "Piper, you are suspended, effective immediately," he declared. The words hung in the air. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't pain. It was the snapping of a tether. "Suspended?" I repeated. "Without pay," Richard added, enjoying the moment. "You will pack your things and leave this building. You are not to return, and you are not to access company systems until you are ready to stand in this room, apologize to your sister, and fix the mess you made with Vanguard." Lila crossed her arms, beaming. She looked like a cat that had just been given a bowl of heavy cream. "This is a mistake, Richard," I said, using his first name intentionally. "If I leave, there is no one to manage the logistics of the pivot I just promised the client." "We will manage," Richard scoffed. "We did fine before you, and we will do fine without you. Maybe this will teach you some humility. Maybe a few weeks without a paycheck will remind you that you serve the family, not the other way around." He pointed to the door. "Go on, get out. Come back when you are ready to beg." The room waited. The director of finance was staring at his shoes. The VP of marketing was holding her breath. They expected the usual. They expected Piper, the dutiful daughter, to flush red, to stammer, to plead her case. They expected me to cry. They expected me to say, "But Dad, please, I was just trying to help." They expected me to accept the shame they were trying to drape over my shoulders. I looked at Richard. I saw a man who had not looked at a balance sheet in 5 years. I looked at Lila. I saw a woman who could not tell the difference between a load-bearing wall and drywall. I looked at the company I had built from the inside out, the systems I had designed, the fires I had put out every single day for a decade. And I realized something profound. I was not the one who needed this job. They were. I felt a sudden, icy calm wash over me. It was the clarity of a surgeon realizing the limb is gangrenous and must be severed to save the body. Only in this case, I was the body, and they were the rot. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at the stunned faces of my colleagues. I simply reached over, picked up my leather notebook, and closed it with a soft snap. I capped my pen. I looked Richard dead in the eye. "Okay then," I said. I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room, leaving the door wide open behind me. The walk from the conference room to my office was only 40 feet, but it felt like crossing a bridge between two distinct lives. Behind me lay the noise of my father's shouting and the suffocating atmosphere of familial obligation. Ahead of me lay silence. I entered my office and closed the door. The latch clicked with a finality that echoed in the quiet room. For a moment, I just stood there, leaning my back against the wood, breathing in the scent of lemon polish and old paper. This room had been my home for 10 years. I had spent more waking hours within these 4 walls than I had in my own apartment. I knew how the afternoon light hit the bookshelf at 3 in the afternoon. I knew that the floorboard under the guest chair creaked if you leaned too far forward. I walked over to my desk, the massive oak surface that I had inherited from a predecessor who had retired with a gold watch and a bad heart condition. I sat down, but I did not turn on my computer. Instead, I opened the bottom drawer. I began to pack. It was a methodical process. I did not sweep things into a box in a fit of rage. I was not the heroine in a melodrama. I was an operation manager, and I was efficient. I took the framed photograph of my mother, taken 3 months before the cancer claimed her. She was smiling in the photo, a sad, knowing smile that I had never quite understood until today. I wrapped it carefully in a scarf I kept in the office for cold days. Next came my personal journals, not the company ledgers, but the black moleskin notebooks where I jotted down ideas, frustrations, and the occasional dream of a life where I was not fixing someone else's mess. I stacked them neatly. As I placed a ceramic pen holder, a gift from a vendor, into the box, a memory surfaced, sharp and stinging. I was 12 years old. Lila was 14. We were in the living room of the old house on Elm Street. Lila had been practicing her baton twirling for the school talent show. She was terrible at it, clumsy and impatient, but she demanded an audience. She had tossed the metal baton high into the air, missing the catch completely. It had crashed into the antique display cabinet, shattering a porcelain vase that had belonged to our grandmother. I remembered the sound of the crash, the way Lila's face had crumpled not in guilt, but in immediate, weaponized panic. When our father ran into the room, his face purple with fury, Lila had pointed a trembling finger at me. Piper distracted me. She made a noise and I lost my concentration. Richard had turned to me. He did not ask if it was true. He simply looked at me with that disappointed heaviness that weighed more than a physical blow. "Piper, you know your sister needs focus," he had said. "Why can you not be more considerate? You are the grounded one. You should know better." I had taken the scolding. I had cleaned up the shards. I had glued the vase back together, cutting my fingers on the jagged edges, while Lila went out for ice cream with him to calm her nerves. That was the dynamic. I was the foundation, unseen and trodden upon, and she was the decoration that required constant polishing. They called me the grounded one, not as a compliment, but as a utility. I was grounded so they could fly. A knock on the door broke my reverie. It was Ben, the director of logistics. He pushed the door open tentatively, his face pale. He looked at the box on my desk, and then at the empty surface where my laptop usually sat. "Piper," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you cannot be serious." I continued to pack. I picked up my favorite stapler. It was red. I had bought it myself because the company issued gray ones, and I wanted one small thing that was mine. "I am suspended, Ben," I said calmly. "I am following orders." "You know the Vanguard project falls apart without you," he said. Stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind him, "Lila does not know the difference between FOB shipping point and FOB destination. She approved a shipping route through a conflict zone last week because she thought the name of the port sounded exotic. You caught that. If you are not here to catch the next one, the cargo gets seized." "Then the cargo gets seized," I said. Ben stared at me. He had worked with me for 6 years. He had seen me work through the flu, through holidays, through the funeral of my grandmother. He had never seen me stop. "You are really letting it burn?" he asked. I looked at him. I liked Ben. He was a good man with 3 kids and a mortgage. I felt a twinge of guilt, but I shoved it down. I could not save them anymore. "I am not lighting the match. Ben," I said softly, "I am just refusing to be the fire extinguisher for the first time in my life." He stood there for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He understood. He turned to leave, but stopped with his hand on the doorknob. "Good luck, Piper," he said. I waited until he was gone, then finished packing. It took me 20 minutes to erase a decade of existence. I put the box under my arm, took my coat, and walked out of the building. I did not look back at the security guard who watched me with confused eyes. I did not look up at the glass windows of the executive suite on the top floor. I drove home in silence. The radio remained off. I needed to hear my own thoughts, which were racing at a speed that frightened me. When I entered my apartment, the quiet was different here. It was usually a lonely quiet, a reminder that I had sacrificed a personal life for a career that did not love me back. Today, it felt like a sanctuary. I placed the box on the kitchen island and poured myself a glass of water. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. It buzzed again, and again. I pulled it out, expecting a rage-filled text from my father or a gloating one from Lila. The name on the screen was Marianne, my mother's sister. I stared at the screen. We rarely spoke. After Mom died, Richard had slowly cut ties with her side of the family, claiming they were bad influences. The truth was, Marianne was the only one who ever stood up to him. I swiped to answer. "Hello, Aunt Marianne?" "Piper." Her voice was warm, a sharp contrast to the ice I had been swimming in all day. I heard, "News travels fast," I said, leaning against the counter. "Your cousin works in accounting at the firm. She reminded me. She told me Richard suspended you. She said it was brutal." "It was necessary," I said, surprising myself. There was a pause on the line. Then, Marianne sighed. "I have been waiting for this day. Honey, I really have." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I was cleaning out the attic last week," she said. "I found a box of your mother's things that she left with me before she passed. She didn't want Richard to have them. There is a journal in there. Piper." "A journal?" "She wrote about you," Marianne said, her voice trembling slightly. "She wrote about how much it hurt her to see Richard mold you into a shield for Lila. There is an entry from when you were 10. She wrote, 'I fear Richard is teaching Piper that her worth is measured only by how much pain she can absorb for the family. I have to find a way to protect her when I'm gone.'" I felt the tears prick my eyes then, hot and sudden. For years, I had told myself I was just being sensitive, that I was imagining the bias, that if I just worked harder, If I was just more perfect, they would see me. She saw you. Piper, Marianne continued. She always saw you. She knew this day would come. She knew they would push you until you broke or you bit back. I am not broken, I whispered. Good, Marianne said firmly. Then bite back. You are a Thomas. Yes, but you are a Walsh too, and we do not lay down and die. We talked for a few more minutes, but the conversation had shifted something inside me. The vague sense of injustice I had felt all my life solidified into a concrete fact. I was not crazy. I was not jealous. I was a victim of a systemic design intended to exploit me. I hung up the phone and walked into my home office. I felt a sudden, urgent need to see the paperwork, not the project files, but my own. I unlocked the fireproof safe in the corner and pulled out a thick blue folder. My employment contract. I had signed this 3 years ago, when I was promoted to COO. Richard had barely read it. He was too busy planning a golf trip. He had told me to have legal draw it up and he would sign it. But I had not just let legal draw it up. I had sat with the corporate attorney, a woman named Sarah who had since moved to a competitor, and we had drafted specific clauses. At the time, I told myself it was standard procedure to protect executive officers in a volatile market. I told myself it was to protect the company from wrongful termination suits. Now, as I flipped through the pages, I realized that my subconscious had been preparing for war long before my conscious mind accepted it. I found Clause 17, Section C. In the event of an involuntary suspension of duties without cause, defined as a suspension lacking documented evidence of gross negligence or criminal misconduct, the officer retains the right to consider said suspension as constructive dismissal. My finger traced the line. Constructive dismissal. I read on. Upon invocation of constructive dismissal, the officer is entitled to immediate vesting of all stock options. My heart hammered against my ribs. Furthermore, should the officer choose to resign following an event of constructive dismissal, they are released from all non-compete agreements due to the breach of good faith by the employer. I sat back in my chair. The room seemed to spin slightly. Richard had suspended me for refusing to apologize to my sister. He had done it verbally, in front of witnesses, with zero documentation of negligence on my part. In fact, the only documentation that existed, my email to Vanguard, proved I was acting in the fiduciary interest of the company. He had not just suspended his daughter, he had handed his chief operating officer a loaded gun. He thought he had sent a child to her room without supper. He did not realize he had just breached a binding legal contract with a senior executive who owned 5% of the company stock options. Options that, according to this piece of paper, would become fully mine the moment I resigned. And the non-compete? That was the key. Without the non-compete, I could take my knowledge, my contacts, and my reputation anywhere. I could go to a competitor. I could start my own firm. I could consult for the very clients Lila was lying to. I looked at the clock. It was 7 in the evening. I had spent 24 hours in silence. I had let them think I was wallowing. I had let them think I was afraid. I reached for my laptop. The silence of the room was no longer empty. It was filled with the hum of potential energy. I was not just going to quit. I was going to execute the most precise strategic exit in the history of Thomas Ridge Holdings. I opened a blank document. I did not type Dear Dad. I typed, To the Board of Directors. The decision was made. The sadness was gone, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of the numbers I loved so much. They wanted me to pay for my insolence? Okay then. I would send them the bill. The cursor on my laptop screen blinked with a rhythmic, hypnotic, steady beat. It was the only movement in my apartment as the clock on the wall ticked past 10 in the evening. The city outside was alive with the chaotic energy of a Friday night, but inside my home office, the atmosphere was sterile and precise. I was not writing a manifesto. I was not writing a tear-stained letter of grievance. I was writing a legal document. I opened a new file and typed the date at the top. Below it, I addressed it to the Board of Directors of Thomas Ridge Holdings, copying the Human Resources Department and the Office of the General Counsel. Subject: Resignation and notice of constructive dismissal. The words looked sharp in black ink against the white background. I began to type, my fingers moving with the muscle memory of a pianist playing a concerto she had practiced in her sleep. Dear members of the board, please accept this letter as formal notification of my resignation from the position of Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. I paused, taking a sip of the cold water sitting beside me. This was the easy part. Now came the surgical strike. This resignation is submitted in response to the indefinite suspension without pay issued by CEO Richard Thomas on the 20th of October. As this suspension was issued without documented cause, performance review, or prior written warning, and was explicitly conditioned upon a personal, non-professional action unrelated to my fiduciary duties, I am treating this action as a constructive dismissal pursuant to Clause 17, Section C of my employment agreement. I read it back. It was devoid of emotion. It did not mention that Richard was my father. It did not mention that Lila was my sister. It treated them as they had treated me, as liabilities. In accordance with the terms of my contract, I hereby exercise my right to the immediate vesting of all outstanding stock options. Furthermore, as the company has breached the covenant of good faith and fair dealing, I consider all non-compete and non-solicitation clauses within my original contract to be null and void. I saved the document as a PDF. It was a shield. Now, I needed the sword. I minimized the resignation letter and opened my email archives. I had backed up my entire server to a private cloud storage drive 6 months ago, a paranoid habit that now felt like divine intervention. I began to pull files. I created a folder named Operational Handover and Risk Assessment. If I was leaving, I had a duty, a legal, fiduciary duty, to ensure the company knew exactly what state the operations were in. If they chose to ignore it, that was their negligence, but they could never say they were not warned. I started with the Vanguard project. I pulled up an email chain from 3 months ago. Lila had forwarded a request from the client asking if we could advance the timeline by 4 weeks. Lila's reply: absolutely. We have plenty of slack in the schedule. I will make it happen. My reply: time-stamped 10 minutes later. Lila: we do not have slack. We are waiting on the zoning permits for the South Annex. If we accelerate, we violate the municipal code. We cannot promise this date. Lila's response to me: stop being such a buzzkill. Piper, Dad says to get it done. My follow-up: I am logging my formal objection to this timeline modification due to regulatory risk. I dragged the entire thread into the folder. I found another chain regarding the budget for the faltering structural steel acquisition. Lila had categorized a $50,000 rush fee as client entertainment to hide the overrun from the quarterly audit. I had flagged it and recategorized it. She had changed it back. My email to finance: the expense labeled under account code 402 is misclassified. It is a logistics penalty, not a dinner. Please correct this to reflect the true cost of the project. I added that to the folder. I worked for 2 hours, methodically combing through the wreckage of the last year. I found safety reports I had commissioned that Richard had ignored. I found vendor contracts Lila had signed without legal review, exposing us to massive liability if the price of raw materials fluctuated by more than 5%. I found the minutes from meetings where I had explicitly outlined the disaster we were currently walking into, only to be silenced by Richard. By midnight, the folder contained 40 distinct documents. It was a dossier of incompetence. It proved that every delay, every over-budget line item, and every friction point with the client was not a result of bad luck, but of specific documented decisions made by Lila Thomas and ratified by Richard Thomas against the advice of the COO. I zipped the folder. I opened a new email. To Richard Thomas, Lila Thomas. CC, the entire Board of Directors, General Counsel, Chief Financial Officer, VP of Human Resources, External Audit Partners. The list of recipients was long. It included people who only saw me as the quiet daughter in the background. It included investors who thought Richard was a genius. It included the external auditors who would be very interested to know about the creative accounting regarding the steel shipment. Subject: Final operational status report and handover documentation. I began to write the body of the email. To the executive leadership team. Attached: Please find the comprehensive operational data regarding the Vanguard account and pending infrastructure projects, as I am no longer employed by Thomas Ridge Holdings, effective immediately. I am providing this data to ensure the board has full visibility into the current risk exposure of the firm. I kept it dry. I did not accuse. I simply pointed. Please direct specific attention to Exhibit A, regarding the permit status for the South Annex, which contradicts the timeline currently held by the client. Please also review Exhibit B, detailing the supply chain insolvency that was flagged on the 12th of August but not addressed. This data serves as my final act of due diligence. The responsibility for mitigating these risks now rests solely with the remaining executive officers. Regards, Piper Thomas. I attached the resignation letter and the zipped folder of evidence. My mouse hovered over the send button. If I sent it now, it would be buried in the late-night influx of newsletters and spam. Richard might see it when he woke up to use the bathroom and delete it before anyone else saw it. He might try to have it scrub the server. No, this needed to be seen by everyone at the same time. I clicked the arrow next to the send button. Schedule send. I scrolled through the time options. The weekly executive meeting started at 9 in the morning. Everyone would be settling in at their desks around 8:30. I selected 8 o'clock in the morning. I clicked schedule. The message disappeared from my drafts and settled into the outbox, a digital time bomb ticking silently in the cloud. I sat back, exhaling a breath I felt I had been holding for a lifetime. My hands were steady. My heart rate was slow. It was terrifying how calm I felt. I had just dismantled my family legacy with a few kilobytes of data, and all I could think about was whether I had any milk left for coffee. I was not done yet. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact named Marcus Vance. He was a high-powered employment attorney I had met at a conference 2 years ago. We had shared a drink, and he had jokingly told me that if I ever wanted to escape the family circus, I should call him. It was 1 in the morning, but I knew lawyers like Marcus lived by their billable hours. I sent a text. Marcus, it is Piper Thomas. I have a constructive dismissal case involving a C-suite executive with a vesting clause and a non-compete dispute. The documentation is bulletproof. I need representation as of 8 in the morning. Are you available? I put the phone down on the desk. 3 minutes later, the screen lit up. I am always available for a winning case. Send me the contract. I will have my team review it by 7. I smiled. It was the first time I had smiled all day. I forwarded the PDF of my contract to his encrypted email address. Finally, I opened my LinkedIn messages. 6 months ago, a headhunter from a global firm had reached out to me. She had been aggressive, telling me that my operational efficiency scores were in the top 1% of the industry. I had politely declined, citing loyalty to the family business. I found her thread. Her name was Sarah. I typed a message. Sarah, regarding your inquiry from last spring, my situation has changed. I am ready to talk. I hit enter. I closed my laptop. The screen went black. Reflecting my face, I looked different. The hesitation around my eyes was gone. I stood up and walked to the window of my apartment. The city lights were blurring in the mist. Somewhere out there, in the sprawling mansion on the hill, my father and sister were sleeping soundly. They were likely dreaming of their victory. They thought they had taught me a lesson. They thought I was lying in bed, crying, wondering how to beg for their forgiveness. They had no idea that I had just signed the death warrant for their arrogance. I turned away from the window and walked to my bedroom. I needed to sleep. I wanted to be well rested when the world burned down in the morning. I was not there to see it, but I did not need to be. I knew the choreography of Thomas Ridge Holdings better than I knew the beat of my own heart. I could close my eyes and reconstruct the scene frame by frame, utilizing the time-stamped read receipts and the frantic voicemails that would flood my burner phone later that morning as my primary data points. It began at 8 o'clock in the morning. This was the time Lila usually arrived. She liked to make an entrance when the junior staff was already seated, ensuring she had an audience. I imagine she walked off the elevator wearing something sharp and expensive. Perhaps the cream-colored blazer she had bought in Milan on the company credit card. The one she claimed was a uniform expense. She would have been carrying a latte. Her head held high, ready to accept my apology. She expected to find me sitting at my desk, humbled, perhaps with red-rimmed eyes, waiting for her to graciously allow me to keep my job. Instead, she found a void. My office has glass walls. It was designed to be transparent, a fishbowl where the COO could be seen working at all hours. When Lila turned the corner, she would have looked through that glass and seen the oak desk stripped bare, no laptop, no monitor, no stack of urgent files, no picture of Mom. Just the polished wood surface, reflecting the overhead fluorescent lights, and right in the center, a single white envelope with her name and our father's name typed on the front. I can picture the confusion on her face. It would not have been fear. Not yet. It would have been annoyance. She likely thought I was pulling a stunt, hiding in the break room or making a dramatic point about being overworked. She probably marched into the office, her heels clicking aggressively on the floor, and snatched up the letter. But before she could tear it open, the digital bomb detonated. At exactly 8 o'clock, the server at Thomas Ridge Holdings processed my scheduled email. The sound of an office receiving a high-priority blast email is distinct. It is not a single ping. It is a cascading ripple of chimes and vibrations. It starts with the executive assistants outside the boardroom. Ding, ding, ding. Then it spreads to the open-plan floor where the project managers sit. Then, it penetrates the closed doors of the executive suites. In the main conference room, the board of directors was settling in for the quarterly strategy meeting. My father, Richard, would have been at the head of the table, likely complaining about the coffee quality. Then, the phones on the table lit up in unison. Richard notoriously hated phones in meetings, but he would have seen the screen of the director of finance, who sat to his left. The subject line was truncated, but the sender name was clear: Piper Thomas. I imagine the director of finance, a man named Marcus who sweated easily, opened it first. He would have seen the attachment, resignation and constructive dismissal notice. He would have seen the CC list. The silence in that room must have been absolute. Then, the door to the conference room burst open. It was not Lila. It was Arthur, the general counsel. Arthur was a man who prided himself on never running. Yet the security footage I would later subpoena showed him practically sprinting down the hallway. He did not knock. He threw the door wide and stared at Richard, his face the color of wet ash. "Do not open the attachment on the server," Arthur yelled, panic stripping away his usual legal composure. But it was too late. Richard was already reading it on his tablet. I can visualize the blood draining from my father's face. He did not read the emotional subtext because there was none. He read the legal terms. Clause 17. Constructive dismissal. Immediate vesting. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and dawning horror. "Why is she talking about a breach of contract? I just sent her home for a few days." Arthur walked to the table, gripping the back of a chair for support. "She is not talking about a timeout." "Richard," Arthur said, his voice tight, "she has triggered the nuclear option. She has resigned citing a hostile work environment and lack of cause, and she copied the external auditors." The external auditors. That was the phrase that turned the room from confused to terrified. The board members, usually passive figures who enjoyed their dividends and free lunches, suddenly sat up. If the auditors were involved, their personal liability insurance was at risk. And then, Lila walked in. She was holding my physical resignation letter, waving it like a prop. "She quit," Lila announced, throwing the paper onto the table. "She actually quit. Can you believe the drama? She thinks we are going to beg her to come back. Well, I say good riddance. Now I can finally run this project without her constant negativity." She stopped. She looked around the room. She saw 12 men and women looking at her not with admiration, but with the cold, predatory gaze of people realizing they were trapped in a burning building with an arsonist. "Sit down, Lila," Richard said. It was not a request. Lila blinked. "Daddy?" "I said sit down," Richard roared. Lila dropped into a chair, looking stunned. She had never been yelled at in front of the board. She sent a file. Marcus, the finance director, whispered, scrolling through the attachments on his iPad. "It is not just a resignation. It is, good Lord, it is a full compliance report. Put it on the screen," a board member named Elias commanded. Elias represented the venture capital firm that held 20% of our stock. He was not a man who cared about family dynamics. He cared about yield. "No, wait, we should vet it first." Arthur tried to intervene, knowing exactly what was coming. "Put it on the screen," Elias shouted. The projector hummed to life. The blue light washed over the room, replacing the marketing slides Lila had prepared. Instead of her glossy renderings of the new building, the screen displayed Exhibit A, Supply Chain Insolvency and Risk Assessment. There, in high-definition black and white, was the email chain I had saved. The timestamp was 3 months ago. From Piper Thomas to Lila Thomas. Subject: urgent. Structural steel delay. Content: Lila. We cannot promise the November delivery. The steel is back-ordered. If you confirm this date with Vanguard, we are liable for $50,000 a day in damages. Please acknowledge. Below it was Lila's reply. From Lila Thomas. Content. Stop worrying. I will handle it. Do not bore the client with logistics. The room was so quiet, you could likely hear the hum of the hard drive. Then came the next slide. The budget report. The one showing the funds Lila had misappropriated for client entertainment that I had flagged as a compliance violation. Elias stood up. He walked over to the screen, tracing the numbers with his finger. "Richard," he said, his voice dangerously low, "did you know about this?" Richard sputtered. "Piper handles the operations. If there was a delay, she should have fixed it." "She did try to fix it," Marcus said, pointing to the screen. "Look at the next email. She escalated it to you. Richard." The screen refreshed. From Piper Thomas to Richard Thomas. Subject: risk escalation. Vanguard project. Content: Dad. Lila is overriding the safety protocols to speed up the timeline. This is a violation of our insurance policy. I need you to intervene. And Richard's reply, brief and dismissive. Let your sister lead. Piper, support her. Lila stood up, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "This is fake," she screamed. "She forged these. She is jealous because I am the face of this company. She is trying to frame me." Arthur, the general counsel, shook his head slowly. He looked defeated. "These are DKIM authenticated emails. Lila," he said softly, "they are pulled directly from the server archives. They are not fake. And because she copied the external auditors, we cannot delete them. They have them too." "What does that mean?" Lila asked, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "It means," Elias said, turning to face Richard, "that we are currently in breach of contract with our largest client, and we have documented proof that the CEO and the head of client relations conspired to hide it despite warnings from the COO." He looked at the empty chair where I usually sat. "She did not just quit." "Richard," Elias continued, "she handed the auditors a confession signed by you." Richard looked at the screen. He looked at the emails he had ignored, the warnings he had dismissed as my pessimism. He looked at Lila, who was now frantically texting someone, probably her husband, under the table. For the first time in his life, Richard Thomas looked old. "Get her on the phone," Richard rasped. "She will not answer," Arthur said. He was looking at his own phone now. "I just got an email from Marcus Vance." "Who is Marcus Vance?" Lila snapped. "He is the most aggressive employment litigator in the state," Arthur replied. "He says he is representing Piper. He says all future communication must go through his office, and he says that if we attempt to contact his client directly, He will file a restraining order and leak this entire dossier to the trade press. The trade press. That was the final nail. If this got out, the stock price would crater by noon. Richard sank back into his chair. He looked at the resignation letter Lila had thrown on the table. It lay there, crisp and white, a symbol of the competence he had exiled. She planned this, Lila hissed. She planned this whole thing. No, Elias said, sitting down and crossing his arms. She didn't plan it. You two gave her the ammunition. She just finally decided to pull the trigger. The meeting descended into chaos. Voices were raised. Blame was thrown like grenades. But outside the glass walls of the conference room, the office was eerily quiet. The junior staff sat at their desks, heads down, typing furiously. They had seen the emails too. They knew what I knew. The captain had left the ship, and she had taken the navigation charts with her. I was sitting in a cafe 3 blocks away, watching the building from a safe distance. I saw the lights on the executive floor stay on. I saw the frantic pacing through the windows. I sipped my black coffee, tasting the bitterness, and checked my watch. 8:30 in the morning. It had taken exactly 30 minutes to dismantle an empire. I picked up my phone. There was a text from the headhunter. Sarah. I saw the news, or rather, I heard the rumors already. Are you free for lunch? I typed back. I am free for the rest of my life. I put the phone down and watched the sun reflect off the glass tower of Thomas Ridge Holdings. It looked the same as it always had. Tall, imposing, invincible, but I knew the truth. It was hollow, and now, everyone else knew it too. The glass doors of the Thomas Ridge Holdings lobby slid open with a soft hiss. It had been exactly 48 hours since I walked out, but the air inside felt different. It was no longer the air of my inheritance or my burden. It was simply the conditioned air of a building where I used to work. I walked to the security desk, the guard, a man named Henry, who I had greeted every morning for 6 years, looked down at his logbook, avoiding my eyes. Name? He asked, his voice stiff. Piper Thomas, I said. I am here to see Arthur Miller in legal. He typed slowly, printed a sticker, and slid it across the marble counter. It was a visitor badge, a white paper square with the word visitor printed in bold black letters. I peeled the backing off and stuck it to the lapel of my navy blazer. It felt like a medal of honor. I did not go up alone. Beside me stood Marcus Vance. Marcus was 6'2" of impeccably tailored aggression. He carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to crack a skull, and he wore a smile that terrified people. We did not go to the executive suite on the top floor. I had stipulated in my conditions that we would meet on the 4th floor, in the mediation room usually reserved for settling vendor disputes. It was neutral ground. It had no family portraits on the walls. It had no memories. When we entered, they were already there. Richard sat at the head of the oval table. He looked tired. The lines around his mouth were deeper than I remembered, etched by 2 days of panic and damage control. Lila sat next to him, her arms crossed so tightly across her chest that her knuckles were white. Arthur, the general counsel, sat opposite them, surrounded by stacks of files. There was one other person in the room, a court stenographer I had hired, sitting in the corner with her machine ready. What is she doing here? Richard asked, pointing at the stenographer. She is here to create an official record of this meeting. Mr. Thomas? Marcus answered smoothly, pulling out a chair for me. Since we are discussing the severance of a C-suite executive and the disposition of significant equity, we require a verbatim transcript to prevent any future misunderstandings. Richard scoffed. This is not a deposition. This is a family conversation. This is a legal negotiation. I corrected him. I sat down. I did not look at my father with warmth. I looked at him with the same detached scrutiny I used to apply to quarterly variance reports. Piper, please, Arthur said, rubbing his temples. We do not need to do this the hard way. The board is in an uproar. The auditors are camped out in the conference room. We need to de-escalate. I am not here to escalate or de-escalate, I said. I am here to finalize the paperwork. I slid a folder across the table. This confirms my resignation effective immediately. I stated, it also formally triggers the payout clause under constructive dismissal. I expect the stock transfer to be initiated by the end of business today. Lila slammed her hand on the table. You cannot just demand 5% of the company, she shouted. You quit. You walked out on us. You abandoned the team right before the Vanguard inspection. I looked at Lila. She was wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, yet she looked small. I did not abandon the team. Lila, I said calmly, I was suspended. I was ordered to leave the premises. I followed the CEO's directive. You know that was just a heat-of-the-moment thing, Richard interjected. Leaning forward, his voice took on that pleading, manipulative tone he reserved for when he needed something. Piper, honey, I was angry. Parents get angry. We fight. That is what families do. You do not destroy the family business because your father lost his temper. I turned to the stenographer. Please note that the CEO admits to making personnel decisions based on emotional outbursts rather than professional conduct. I said. The stenographer's fingers flew across the keys. Stop that, Richard snapped. Piper, be reasonable. You are my daughter. I raised you. I gave you this job. I gave you everything you have. And this is how you repay me? By holding a gun to my head? You gave me a job. Yes, I replied. And I gave you 10 years of 60-hour work weeks. I gave you a 30% increase in operational efficiency. I gave you clean audits. I earned my salary. Richard, I am not ungrateful. I am simply finished. I turned to Arthur. Does the company dispute the validity of Clause 17? I asked. Arthur sighed. He looked at Richard, then back at me. He looked like a man who wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Richard, he said softly, we have reviewed the contract. Piper is correct. The suspension was issued verbally, in front of witnesses, without a performance improvement plan and without a cited violation of company policy. Under the strict definition of the agreement you signed 3 years ago, it constitutes a hostile action forcing resignation. Richard turned purple. I am the CEO. I can suspend whoever I want. Not without cause, Mr. Thomas, Marcus intervened, his voice like smooth gravel. Not when you are dealing with an officer of the corporation who has a vested interest. You treated a shareholder like an intern. That was an expensive mistake. It is blackmail! Lila screamed. She stood up, pointing a shaking finger at me. She set this whole thing up. She baited us. She knew we were stressed about Vanguard, and she pushed buttons until Daddy snapped so she could steal the stock. It is fraud. Sit down, Ms. Thomas, Marcus said. He did not raise his voice, but the command was absolute. I am not sitting down, Lila cried. She is a thief. She is trying to bankrupt us. Arthur, please explain the legal definition of defamation to Ms. Thomas, Marcus said, looking at his fingernails. Because if she continues to accuse my client of a crime on the official record, I will add a slander suit to the list of your problems. Arthur closed his eyes for a second. Lila, please be quiet. There is no evidence of fraud. Piper is exercising a contractual right. But she hates us, Lila wailed. She is doing this out of spite. I looked at my sister. For years, I had cleaned up her messes. I had rewritten her reports. I had apologized to clients she had offended. I had let her take credit for my ideas because I thought it kept the peace. I thought if I just held the family together, eventually they would appreciate the glue. I do not hate you, Lila, I said. The room went quiet. I do not feel anything for you at all, I continued. You are a liability I no longer have to manage. Richard looked at me with genuine shock. He had expected anger. He had expected tears. He did not know how to handle indifference. Piper, he said, his voice cracking. You can't mean that. We are your family. Look, if this is about the apology, you don't have to apologize, okay? I rescind the order. You can come back. We will forget this happened. I will give you a raise. We will fix this. I shook my head slowly. You still do not understand. I said, I am not negotiating for a better seat at the table. Richard, I am leaving the room. But why? Richard asked. He sounded like a child. Why burn it all down? You win, okay? You proved your point. You are smarter than us. Is that what you want to hear? I looked at the mahogany table. I traced the grain of the wood with my eyes. I remembered the birthday parties I missed because I was fixing a server crash. I remembered the dates I canceled because Lila needed help with a presentation she hadn't started. I remembered the way my mother looked in those final days, gripping my hand, trying to tell me something she didn't have the breath to say. I think she wanted to tell me to run. I looked up at Richard. I did not leave to win, I said. I leaned forward, locking eyes with the man who had been my boss first and my father second for as long as I could remember. I left to stop being a tool. I said, I left because for 33 years, I have been a hammer, a shield, a crutch, and a scapegoat. I have been a function, Richard, not a person, and I'm tired of being useful to people who are useless to me. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I stood up. My lawyer has the routing number for the wire transfer. I said, you have 24 hours to execute the stock vesting before we file the injunction to freeze the company assets. I turned to go. Piper, Lila shouted, if you walk out that door, you are dead to us. Do you hear me? I will never speak to you again. I paused at the door. I looked back at them. Richard, looking defeated and small. Lila, vibrating with impotent rage. Arthur, looking at his files with resignation. Okay then, I said. I walked out of the room. Marcus followed me, closing the heavy door with a solid, definitive click. We walked to the elevator in silence. When the doors closed, shielding us from the view of the hallway, Marcus looked at me. That was impressive, he said. I looked at the numbers on the display counting down. 4th floor, 3rd floor, 2nd floor. It is done? I asked. It is done. Marcus confirmed. They have no leverage. Arthur knows it. They will pay you out to avoid a lawsuit that would expose their incompetence to the public. You are a wealthy woman, Piper, and you are a free one. The elevator doors opened to the lobby. The air rushed in. I walked toward the exit. I stripped the visitor badge off my lapel. I did not throw it in the trash. I put it in my pocket. I wanted to keep it. It was the first label I had worn in this building that was actually true. I was just a visitor here. I always had been. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the sunlight. The city was loud and bright and chaotic. It was messy. It was perfect. I hailed a taxi. For the first time in 10 years, I did not have a destination. I did not have a meeting to get to. I did not have a fire to put out. Where to? The driver asked. I sat back against the worn leather seat. Just drive, I said. Drive north. I took my phone out of my pocket. I had one more thing to do. I opened my contacts and found the number for the headhunter. I was ready to build something of my own. Something where the foundation was made of concrete, not blood. The week following my departure from Thomas Ridge Holdings was not characterized by the silence of a vacuum, but rather by the deafening noise of a structure collapsing under its own weight. I was no longer in the building, but I did not need to be. I had spent a decade building the communication networks of that company, and I still had friends who knew how to use them. The first domino fell on Tuesday morning, exactly 3 days after the board meeting. Vanguard, the client Lila had charmed with promises of impossible deadlines, did not simply send an email, they sent a legal team, according to Ben, who was texting me updates from the safety of the warehouse. 3 lawyers and 2 independent structural engineers arrived at the headquarters at 9 in the morning. They bypassed the coffee and pastries Lila had set up in the lobby. They demanded to see the raw data regarding the South Annex permits. Lila attempted to intervene. She tried to pull her usual routine, the dazzling smile, the vague assurances about proprietary processes. It might have worked on a lonely zoning clerk, but it did not work on a corporate litigator representing a $100 million investment. When they compared the dates on the permits to the timeline Lila had attached to the contract, the discrepancy was not a matter of days. It was a matter of months. By noon, Vanguard had formally issued a notice of breach. They paused all payments. That was a cash flow hit of $400,000 a week. The second domino was the internal rot that the finance department finally decided to smell. With the external auditors breathing down their necks, the finance team stopped rubber-stamping Lila's expenses. For years, Richard had bullied them into categorizing her mistakes as marketing or client development, but with the threat of personal liability hanging over them, the accountants developed a sudden and rigid backbone. They started digging into the miscellaneous logistics code. This was the slush fund Lila used to cover up her errors. When she forgot to order concrete, she would pay triple the market rate to get it rushed, hiding the cost in this code. When she insulted a vendor, she would send expensive gift baskets using these funds. By Wednesday afternoon, the chief financial officer had compiled a report showing that Lila's projects were running 30% over budget. Not the 5% she claimed in her PowerPoints. The profitability she boasted about was a mirage created by moving losses into general overhead. Then came the leak. I do not know who did it. It could have been a disgruntled executive assistant. It could have been a junior analyst tired of being yelled at. But on Thursday morning, a printed copy of the email chain I had sent to the board, the one where I warned Richard about the steel delay, and he told me to support my sister, appeared on the bulletin board in the break room. It was taken down within 10 minutes, but in the digital age, 10 minutes is an eternity. Photos of the page circulated on the internal messaging apps. The narrative Richard had tried to spin, that I was a bitter, unstable daughter who abandoned the family, shattered instantly. The staff saw the truth. I was the one trying to save the ship. Richard was the captain steering it into the iceberg because his favorite child wanted to see the ice up close. Morale did not just dip, it evaporated. The engineering team, realizing they were being led by people who ignored safety protocols for the sake of appearances, threatened a walkout. That was when the board of directors stepped in. I heard about the emergency session from Arthur, the general counsel, who called me ostensibly to clarify a detail about my stock transfer, but mostly to vent. They are eating him alive. Piper, Arthur whispered into the phone. Elias is threatening to sue Richard for breach of fiduciary duty if he does not sideline Lila immediately. Sideline her? I asked, sipping tea in my new living room. I thought she was the face of the company. Not anymore, Arthur said. They just passed a resolution. All client communications must now be vetted by legal and operations. Lila is not allowed to send an email to Vanguard without 2 signatures. She is furious. She is screaming in her office right now. I felt a cold satisfaction. It wasn't joy. It was the feeling of a mathematical equation finally balancing out. On Friday, my phone rang. The screen displayed a photo I had not looked at in a week. Dad. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Hello, Richard. Piper. His voice sounded thin, stripped of its usual booming authority. We need to talk. I am listening, I said. This Vanguard situation it is more complex than we anticipated, he said, struggling to avoid the word disaster. The auditors are asking questions about the supply chain history that only you know how to answer, and the staff. The staff is unsettled. That sounds like a management problem, I said. I want you to come back, he said. I remained silent. Not as COO, he added quickly. I know we cannot do that right now with the legal settlement, but as a consultant, an external advisor, just to help us navigate this crisis, we will pay you your full rate, double your rate. I looked out the window. I saw the world moving on without Thomas Ridge Holdings. Richard, I said, if I come back, who signs off on the decisions? I do, of course, he said. I am still the CEO. And Lila? I asked. She is still the head of client relations, he said, his voice tightening. We are working on some coaching for her, but we cannot just fire family. Piper, you know that. I laughed. It was a short, dry sound. You fired me, Richard. That was a suspension, he insisted. I took a deep breath. I will not come back as a consultant, I said firmly. A consultant gives advice. You do not need advice. You know exactly what needs to be done. You need someone to make the hard choices you are too weak to make. You need someone to fire the incompetent vendors Lila hired. You need someone to tell Vanguard the ugly truth and renegotiate the timeline. You need someone to tell your other daughter to go home. I can't do that, Piper, he whispered. It would break her heart. Then you will break the company, I said. There was a long silence on the line. I cannot help you, Richard, I said, because you do not want a solution. You want a scapegoat who can do math. I hung up. An hour later, I saw the press release. Thomas Ridge Holdings had announced a strategic reorganization. The language was flowery, but the meaning was clear to anyone who spoke corporate. We are pleased to announce that Benjamin Davis has been promoted to Interim Director of Operations, with full oversight of the Vanguard project. Ben? I smiled. Ben was good. I had trained him myself. He was meticulous, honest, and utterly immune to Lila's charm. He was the one person in that building who would not let her bully him, because he knew where the bodies were buried, or rather, where the missing inventory was hidden. The press release had a second paragraph. Ms. Lila Thomas will be transitioning to a new role as Vice President of Brand Strategy, focusing on long-term vision and corporate philanthropy. It was a demotion dressed in silk. Brand strategy meant she had no operational budget. Philanthropy meant she had no profit and loss responsibility. They had put her in a glass box where she could look pretty but touch nothing. And vice president meant she no longer reported directly to the CEO. She reported to the board. Richard had lost. He had tried to save her dignity, but the board had stripped her of her power, and in doing so, they had stripped him of his absolute control. He was no longer the king of the castle. He was just a manager, answerable to the people who owned the money. I imagined him sitting in his office, the one with the panoramic view of the skyline. I imagined him looking at the empty chair where I used to sit, and the closed door of the office where Lila was likely throwing a vase against the wall. He had wanted us to get along. He had wanted the perfect family picture. He had wanted me to apologize. Now, he had one daughter who was suing him for millions, and another who was a figurehead with a fancy title and no keys to the building. The empire had not just cracked, it had split down the middle, and he was standing alone in the chasm. I turned off my phone. I had a lunch meeting with Sarah, the headhunter. She had a proposition for a role at a logistics firm that was competing directly with Thomas Ridge for a municipal contract. It was time to see if the student could beat the master, or rather, if the master could beat the man who had merely inherited the classroom. The lobby of North Bay Systems did not have a waterfall. It did not have imported Italian marble floors that required a dedicated cleaning crew, nor did it have a wall of fame displaying the founders' golfing trophies. It had polished concrete floors, ergonomic chairs that actually supported your back, and a silence that was industrious rather than oppressive. I walked in at 8:30 in the morning, holding a cup of coffee I had purchased myself. I swiped my badge at the turnstile. It beeped, a cheerful, high-pitched chirping sound. My photo on the ID was new. In it, I wasn't smiling to appease anyone. I looked direct, focused, and calm. My new office was on the 12th floor. It was smaller than my suite at Thomas Ridge, but the view was better, not because of the scenery, it looked out over a shipping yard, but because it was honest. I could see the containers moving. I could see the work being done. I had been the vice president of operations at North Bay for 3 weeks. In those 21 days, I had experienced more culture shock than I had in a lifetime of navigating my family's dysfunction. The shock did not come from incompetence or chaos. It came from the utter, terrifying simplicity of sanity. On my second day, I had discovered a redundancy in the warehousing software that was costing the company roughly $12,000 a month. Old habits die hard. My stomach had knotted. I had spent 2 hours drafting a carefully worded email to the chief technology officer, trying to frame the error as a potential optimization opportunity to avoid bruising his ego. I had prepared a script for the inevitable defensive argument. I had braced myself for the politics. I sent the email at 10 in the morning. At 10:15, the CTO, a man named David who wore hoodies to board meetings, walked into my office. "Nice catch, Piper," he had said, leaning against my doorframe. "I patched the code. We should see the savings hit the ledger by next billing cycle. Thanks." And then he left. I sat there for 10 minutes, staring at the empty doorway, no yelling, no shifting blame, no lecture on how I needed to be more collaborative, just a fix. It was disorienting. I felt like a soldier who had returned from the front lines, diving for cover every time a car backfired, only to realize the war was actually over. This afternoon, I had a quarterly planning meeting. The conference room at North Bay was functional. Whiteboards covered every wall. There were no leather chairs at the head of the table reserved for patriarchs. We sat where we wanted. I presented the projections for Q3. I recommended cutting a vendor who had been with the company for 5 years because their quality control had dipped below 98%. At Thomas Ridge, cutting a legacy vendor required 3 weeks of negotiations, usually involving a golf game between Richard and the vendor's CEO, followed by a lecture on loyalty. Here, the CEO of North Bay, a woman named Elena, who spoke 3 languages and had 0 patience for inefficiency, looked at my slide. "The data is solid?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "Their defect rate has climbed to 3%. It is costing us in returns." "Cut them," Elena said, making a note on her tablet. "Who is the backup?" "I have 3 options vetted." I said, "Logistics Corp is the most viable." "Go with them," she said. "Next item?" It took 30 seconds. A decision that would have been a month-long melodrama in my previous life was handled before my coffee had even cooled. I walked out of that meeting feeling a strange sensation in my chest. It was lightness. I wasn't carrying Richard's ego. I wasn't carrying Lila's incompetence. I was just carrying my laptop. Later that week, I had lunch with Sarah, the headhunter who had placed me here. We met at a bistro halfway between the 2 corporate districts. Sarah ordered a salad. I ordered a steak. I felt like I needed the protein. "You look different," Sarah observed, swirling her iced tea. "I feel different," I admitted. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. I keep waiting for someone to ask me to fix a personal problem or cover up a mistake." "You are going to be waiting a long time," Sarah said. "North Bay hired you for your brain. Piper, not your bloodline." "I have a question," I said, leaning forward. "You said you had been watching me for years. Why? I was just the COO of a family firm. Usually, recruiters ignore people like me. They assume we are just nepotism hires." Sarah smiled. It was a sharp, knowing smile. "We track metrics. Piper, we don't just look at LinkedIn profiles. We look at industry data. We noticed something about Thomas Ridge Holdings 4 years ago. Every time there was a major screw-up with a client, a missed deadline, a permit issue, a PR disaster, it would miraculously resolve itself within 48 hours. I stayed silent. "We started looking at the timestamps," Sarah continued. "The disasters usually happened when you were out of town or on leave. The fixes happened exactly when you clocked back in. We saw the pattern. You were the engine. Everyone else was just the hood ornament. When I saw the rumors about the Vanguard project, I knew you were finally going to break. I just wanted to be there with a catcher's mitt when you jumped." I looked down at my plate. For years. Richard had told me I was lucky to have a job. He had told me I wouldn't survive in the real world without his protection. He had gaslighted me into believing my competence was a product of his mentorship. Sarah was telling me the truth. The world had seen me, even when my father refused to. "Thank you," I whispered. "Don't thank me," Sarah said. "You are making me a fortune in commission. Elena loves you. She says you are the most disciplined operator she has ever seen." The validation was addicting, but the true test came on a Tuesday afternoon. My desk phone rang. It was an external line. "Piper Thomas," I answered. "Is it true?" a gruff male voice asked. I recognized the voice immediately. It was Mr. Henderson, the owner of a massive construction firm that had been a Thomas Ridge client for 20 years. He was a man who chewed cigars and hated contracts longer than 2 pages. "Mr. Henderson," I said, surprised, "how did you get this number?" "I threatened your father's secretary until she gave it to me." He grunted. "Listen to me. Piper, I have got a renewal coming up with Thomas Ridge next month, the big waterfront development." "I know the one," I said. "It is a beautiful project." "I am not signing it with them," he stated flatly. I paused. "Mr. Henderson, I cannot advise you on that. I have a non-solicitation agreement. I cannot poach clients." "I am not being poached, girl," he barked. "I am fleeing a sinking ship. I had a meeting with that interim guy. Ben, nice kid, smart, but then your sister walked in." I closed my eyes. Lila. "She started talking about synergy and aesthetic alignment," Henderson said, sounding disgusted. "She didn't know the price of steel per ton. She didn't know the load-bearing capacity of the pilings. I asked her a simple question about the union contracts, and she told me not to worry my pretty little head about it." I winced. "I don't trust them." "Piper," Henderson said, "I trusted you. You never lied to me. You told me when we were going to be late. You told me when the cost went up. You treated me like a partner, not a piggy bank. If I bring my business to North Bay, will you handle the account?" I looked at the view of the shipping yard. The cranes were moving in a perfect, rhythmic dance. "If you choose to approach North Bay independently, strictly of your own volition," I said, choosing my words carefully to satisfy the legal parameters, "then yes, I would be honored to manage your account." "Good," Henderson said. "Expect a call from my lawyers in the morning." He hung up. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. A $20 million account had just walked through the door, not because of the Thomas name, but because of the Thomas daughter who had been told she was unlikable. I was not unlikable. I was just unwilling to lie. It turned out, in the real world, integrity was a currency far more valuable than charm. Of course, I could not entirely escape the echoes of my old life. The industry was small, and gossip traveled faster than light. I heard the stories. I heard that Vanguard had settled, but only after exacting a heavy penalty that wiped out the quarterly profit. I heard that Richard was aging rapidly, that he had developed a tremor in his hand. I heard that Lila was spending her days in her brand strategy office, shopping online and terrorizing the interns, stripped of any real power but still collecting a paycheck she didn't earn. A month ago, that news would have torn me apart. I would have felt a compulsion to rush back, to fix it, to save them from themselves. Now it felt like reading a news article about a distant country. It was tragic, yes, but it was not my tragedy. That evening, I went home to my apartment. It was quiet. I made myself dinner, a simple pasta dish, and poured a glass of wine. I did not check my work email. I knew the team at North Bay had it handled. I walked to the bookshelf and pulled down a small, leather-bound book, my mother's journal. For the first few days after leaving, I couldn't look at it. It felt too heavy. It felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. But tonight, I opened it. I turned to a page near the end, written just weeks before she died. Her handwriting was shaky, the ink faint. "I worry about Piper." She had written, "She thinks love is something you have to earn through service. She thinks if she carries enough bricks, Richard will finally build her a house. I hope one day she realizes that she is already the architect. She doesn't need him to build the house. She just needs to put down the bricks he forced her to carry and walk away." I ran my finger over the dried ink. I had spent my whole life thinking I was the victim of my family. I thought I was trapped. But Mom knew. She knew I wasn't trapped by walls. I was trapped by my own willingness to endure. I closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf, right next to a framed photo of the North Bay logistics team. I wasn't carrying the bricks anymore. I was building something new. And for the first time in 33 years, the foundation was level. I took a sip of wine. The phone on my counter buzzed. It was a text from Richard. "The auditors are asking about the 2021 tax filings. Call me." I looked at the message. I looked at the time. It was 8 in the evening. I typed a reply. Please direct all inquiries to my attorney. Marcus Vance. Do not contact me personally. I blocked the number. I finished my wine. The silence in the apartment wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a life that finally belonged to me. It was a Tuesday evening, raining with that relentless gray persistence that seems to wash the color out of the entire city. I was in my kitchen, chopping vegetables for a solitary dinner. The rhythm of the knife hitting the cutting board was soothing. Chop, slide, chop, slide. It was a task with a clear beginning and a clear end. Unlike the open-ended crises I used to manage, the doorbell rang. I froze. My building had a doorman, and he usually buzzed up before letting anyone onto the elevator. For someone to be at my door meant they had either charmed or bullied their way past security. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the door. I checked the peephole. It was Richard. He was standing in the hallway, dripping wet. He wasn't wearing his usual trench coat. He was just in a suit, the shoulders dark with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked smaller than I remembered. The camera in the boardroom had hidden the details, but here, under the harsh hallway light, I saw the deepening lines around his eyes and the slight stoop in his posture. I unlocked the door and opened it. "Hello, Dad," I said. He looked at me. He didn't bark an order. He didn't demand to know why I had blocked his number. He just looked at me with a profound, exhausted sadness. "Can I come in?" he asked. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in hours. I stepped aside. He walked in, bringing the smell of rain and expensive cologne into my apartment. He looked around. It was the first time he had ever visited my home, for the 10 years I lived here. He had always been too busy, or he had insisted I come to the estate. He looked at the modern furniture, the books on the shelves, the lack of clutter. "It is nice," he said, quiet. "It suits me," I replied. I did not offer to take his coat. I did not offer him a drink. I stood near the kitchen island, keeping a physical barrier between us. "Why are you here, Richard?" I asked. He flinched at the use of his first name, but he didn't correct me. He walked over to the sofa and sat down heavily, not waiting for an invitation. He rested his elbows on his knees and clasped his hands together. I noticed a slight tremor in his left hand. "The auditors finished their preliminary report today," he said, staring at the floor. I nodded. I expected as much. "They found the structural deficit in the pension fund," he continued. "The one Lila borrowed against to fund the rebrand 2 years ago. I didn't know she had touched that account. Piper, I swear to you, I thought she was using the marketing budget." I said nothing. I knew he hadn't known, but I also knew he had chosen not to look. "We are facing a liquidity crisis," he said. "The stock is down 40%. The banks are calling in the loans. Henderson leaving was the signal for everyone else to run. We are bleeding out." "I am sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. It was sad to watch a house burn, even if you were the one who pointed out the faulty wiring years ago. "I fired Lila today," he said. The words hung in the air. I felt a flicker of surprise, but it was faint. "You fired her?" I repeated. "Removed her from the board, stripped her of all titles. She is gone," she screamed. "She broke a vase. She told me she hated me, but she is gone." He looked up at me then. His eyes were red-rimmed. "I need you back, Piper." I sighed, leaning against the counter. "I told you, I am not consulting." "No, not consulting," he said. Standing up, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. He walked over and placed it on the island in front of me. "This is a deed of transfer," he said. "It gives you 51% of the voting stock, controlling interest, and the CEO title. I will step down to Chairman Emeritus. I will go play golf. I will disappear. It is yours. Piper, the whole thing. You can run it however you want. You can fire who you want. You can fix it." I looked at the paper. It was everything I had spent my 20s dreaming of. It was the keys to the kingdom. It was the ultimate validation. The acknowledgement that I was the heir, the capable one, the leader. 6 months ago, I would have signed it with my own blood. Now, it just looked like a piece of paper. I looked at him. He was watching me with desperate hope. He thought this was what I wanted. He thought this was the price of my return. Why? I asked. What do you mean? He asked, confused. Because it is your legacy. Because you earned it. No, I said, that is not what I mean. I walked around the island so nothing stood between us. I stood 3 feet away from him. Do you want me back because you finally realized I am good at what I do? I asked quietly. Do you want me because you respect my mind? Because you see me as an equal? Or do you want me back because everyone else has left, and your back is breaking, and you have run out of people to carry the load for you? Richard opened his mouth to speak. He wanted to say, because you are good. I could see the lie forming on his lips, the reflex of a salesman. But he stopped. He looked at me, really looked at me, and saw that I would know. He saw that the daughter who used to believe his lies was gone. He closed his mouth. He looked down. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. He couldn't answer, and that was the answer. He slumped. The energy seemed to leave his body. I can't do it alone. Piper, he whispered. I don't know how to fix it. I never did. I was the face. You were the hands. Without you, it is just noise. I nodded slowly. At least it was the truth. I am not coming back. Dad, I said. Piper, please. It is $50 million in assets. I don't care about the assets. I cut him off. I have a job. I have a salary that I earn. I have a team that respects me. I sleep at night. You cannot buy that. He looked at the document on the counter, the bribe that had failed. So that is it? He asked, his voice shaking. You just walk away? You let the family name rot? The family name is just letters on a building. I said, it is not us. I picked up the document and handed it back to him. I will not be your CEO. I said, I will not be your fix-it girl. I will not save Thomas Ridge Holdings. If it fails, it fails. That is the market correcting itself. Richard took the paper. His hand was trembling violently now. He looked like a man who had lost his religion. Then I have lost both of my daughters, he murmured. No, I said firmly. He looked up, startled. You lost your COO, I said, and you lost your scapegoat. But you haven't lost your daughter, unless you want to. I pointed to the living room. If you want to be my father, you can sit on that couch. We can order a pizza. You can ask me about my new apartment. You can tell me about the weather, but we will not talk about the company. We will not talk about Lila. We will not talk about stock prices. He stared at me. The concept seemed alien to him. A relationship with me that wasn't transactional? A conversation that didn't involve me solving a problem for him? I don't know if I know how to do that, he admitted. His voice was incredibly vulnerable. Then you learn, I said, like I had to learn how to walk away. He stood there for a long time. The rain lashed against the window pane. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. Why did you do it? I asked. It was the question that had haunted me for years. Why did you let her get away with everything? Why did you make me the villain? He looked at the deed in his hand. He crumpled it slightly. Because you were strong, he said softly. I frowned. That sounded like a compliment, but it felt like an excuse. Lila. She is fragile, Richard said. She always was. If I told her the truth about her mediocrity, she would shatter. I knew she couldn't handle the world, so I built a world where she could win. He looked at me. But you, Piper? You could take a hit. You could take the blame. I knew you would survive it. I put the weight on you because I knew you could carry it. I used you to protect her. He took a shaky breath. And I used you to protect myself. He added, if you were busy fixing her messes, you wouldn't have time to realize you were better than me. I was afraid. Piper, I was afraid that if I let you shine, you would leave me behind. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was the release of a pressure valve I had been holding shut since I was 12 years old. He hadn't hated me, he had feared me, and he had exploited me. Thank you, I whispered. For what? He asked, looking miserable. For being a terrible father? For telling the truth? I said. I didn't need him to grovel. I didn't need him to buy me a pony or give me the company. I just needed the reality of my life to be acknowledged. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overly sensitive. I was used. I walked over to the kitchen drawer and pulled out a takeout menu. I am ordering pizza from the place on the corner, I said, my voice steady. Pepperoni and mushroom. Do you want some? Richard looked at me. He looked at the door, where his driver was waiting to take him back to his crumbling empire. Then he looked at the couch. He hesitated. He was a man standing on a bridge between two worlds. One was a world of power and pretense that was falling into the sea. The other was a quiet apartment where he had no authority, but where he might, for the first time, actually be known. He took off his wet jacket and laid it over the back of a chair. I hate mushrooms, he said, his voice cracking slightly. We can get half plain, I offered. He nodded. He walked over to the couch and sat down. He looked awkward, uncomfortable, and stripped of his armor. Okay then, he said. I picked up the phone to dial. The company would likely file for bankruptcy within the month. The scandal would be in all the papers. His reputation would be tattered, but as I watched him pick up a coaster and examine it, trying to find a place for his hands, I realized that for the first time in 33 years, my father was actually in the room with me. And that was enough. The pizza boxes were in the recycling bin, and the apartment was quiet again. My father had left an hour ago, stepping back into the rain with a look of strange, bewildered relief on his face. We had not fixed the company, we had not fixed the family, but for the first time, we had ceased fire. However, peace is not the same thing as resolution. I sat on the floor of my living room, surrounded not by corporate spreadsheets, but by the intimate, handwritten history of my mother. The journal Marianne had given me lay open on my lap. I had read it before, but only for the emotion, searching for proof that I was loved. Tonight, I was reading it with the eyes of the chief operating officer I used to be. I was looking for the data she had hidden in the margins of her grief. I turned to an entry dated 14 years ago. It was written 2 days after Richard had named himself CEO, following my grandfather's stroke. Richard is drunk on the title. She wrote, he thinks he is a king. He does not understand that a kingdom requires walls, not just a throne. He looks at Lila and sees a princess. He looks at Piper and sees a bricklayer. He will use the bricklayer to build the castle for the princess. And when the castle is finished, he will leave the bricklayer outside in the cold. I know this. I see it in the way he dismisses Piper's grades and applauds Lila's smile. I ran my finger over the words. She had predicted the dynamic perfectly, but the next paragraph was what stopped my breath. I cannot stop him from favoring Lila. The entry continued, but I can ensure that if he ever tries to throw the bricklayer away, the wall comes down with her. I made him sign the amended trust agreement today. He didn't even read it. He just wanted the voting rights for the merger. He doesn't know about the dead man's switch in Clause 12B. Clause 12B. I stared at the page. My mother was not a lawyer. She was a woman who arranged flowers and hosted charity dinners. But she was also a woman who had watched her husband's ego grow like a tumor for 30 years. I stood up and walked to my home office. I still had the digital archives of the company charter. These were not the operational files I had used to expose Lila. These were the foundational documents, the boring, dense legalese that governed the Thomas Family Trust and its relationship to Thomas Ridge Holdings. I opened the file named Restated Articles of Incorporation and Family Trust Governance, 2010. I scrolled. Section 1, Section 2, Board Composition, Dividend Distribution. I found Section 12. It was titled, Protective Covenants Regarding Lineal Successors. I began to read, translating the legal jargon into plain English in my head. It stated that the company was founded on the principle of multi-generational stability. It defined lineal successors as the biological children of Richard Thomas. Then came subsection B. In the event that a lineal successor holding an executive position is removed from their duties, via an involuntary termination event, defined as termination without cause or constructive dismissal. The family trust dictates an immediate reclassification of all equity held by or owed to said successor. I leaned closer to the screen. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Upon such an event, any unvested options due to the successor shall immediately vest. Furthermore, to prevent the destabilization of the company by hostile internal actors, these shares shall be temporarily reclassified from Class A common stock to Class B, super voting stock, carrying a voting weight of 10-1 for a period of 90 days following the termination. I sat back. The room seemed to tilt. 10-1. I did the math in my head. It was simple, brutal arithmetic. I was owed 5% of the company in stock options. That was the settlement Arthur and Marcus had agreed upon. Richard owned 40%. The board and public investors held the rest. But under Clause 12B, my 5% did not just vest as regular shares. For the next 3 months, they carried 10 times the voting power. That meant my 5% effectively functioned as 50% of the voting weight in any shareholder meeting called during the crisis period. When combined with the shares held by the disgruntled venture capitalists, like Elias, who currently wanted Richard's head on a platter, I did not just have a seat at the table. I was the table. I looked back at the journal. I hope she never has to use it. My mother had written at the bottom of the page, I hope Richard grows up, but if he tries to silence her, this will give her a voice he cannot interrupt. I realized then that my resignation email, the leaked documents, the exposed supply chain rot, all of that was just the smoke. It was the distraction. The real weapon had been buried in a filing cabinet for over a decade, placed there by a mother who knew that one day, her husband would choose his vanity over his competent child. Richard didn't know. I was certain of it. When he came to my apartment tonight, offering me the CEO title and 51% of the stock, he thought he was giving me a gift. He thought he was surrendering. He didn't realize that I already held the power to take it. The irony was suffocating. If I had accepted his offer, I would have been accepting his authority to give it. I would have returned to the fold, validating his control. By refusing him, by staying outside the gates, I remained the trigger man for Clause 12B. I checked the date on my resignation letter. It had been 7 days. The 90-day clock was ticking. I picked up my phone. It was late, almost midnight. I texted Marcus Vance. I need you to pull the 2010 Family Trust Amendment. Check Section 12, Subsection B. Tell me if it is still active. Marcus replied 3 minutes later. He was apparently a vampire who never slept. Give me 10 minutes. I waited. I watched the rain streak the window. I thought about Lila, sitting in her empty office, stripped of her titles but still protected by her father's inability to let her fail completely. I thought about the employees at Thomas Ridge, Ben, the engineers, the receptionists, who were currently worried about their pensions because the stock was tanking. My phone buzzed. It is active. Marcus wrote, it was never repealed. It is ironclad. Piper, do you realize what this means? You have a controlling supermajority until January. You don't need the board's permission to restructure. You can dissolve the board. You can liquidate the assets. You are effectively the dictator of Thomas Ridge Holdings right now. I stared at the screen. Dictator. That was what Richard had been. He had ruled by decree, by emotion, by favoritism. I did not want to be a dictator. I did not want the crown. I had told Richard the truth. I liked my new life. I liked North Bay. I liked being valued for my work. But I could not let the company rot. I could not let the investors lose everything just because my family was dysfunctional. And I could not let Richard limp along, patching holes in a hull that needed to be dry-docked. I had a responsibility, not as a daughter, but as a shareholder with a 10-1 weapon in her pocket. I typed a reply to Marcus. Draft a notice for an emergency shareholder meeting to be held in 48 hours. Agenda: corporate restructuring and governance review, pursuant to Article 12. Who are we inviting? Marcus asked. Everyone, I typed. The board, the trust, and the executive officers. "Does that include Richard?" he asked. "Especially Richard," I replied. I closed the laptop. I walked back to the living room and picked up the journal. I closed it gently and placed it on the bookshelf. "You were right. Mom," I whispered to the empty room. "I was the shield. But you made sure that when they finally put the shield down, they realized it was the only thing holding up the roof." I went to my closet. I pushed aside the soft sweaters and casual blazers I had been wearing at North Bay. I reached to the back and pulled out a suit I hadn't worn since the day I walked out. It was charcoal gray, sharp, severe. It was armor. I would wear it one last time, not to serve the king, and not to beg for his forgiveness. I was going back to abdicate the throne on my own terms. The boardroom of Thomas Ridge Holdings had not changed in the 10 days since I had last stood within its walls, but the atmosphere was radically different. The air conditioning was still humming its aggressive, low drone, but it could not mask the scent of stale coffee and nervous perspiration. I waited in the hallway with Marcus Vance. Through the glass walls, I could see them. The emergency shareholder meeting was in session. The table was full. Richard sat at the head, looking pale and diminished, flanked by Arthur, the general counsel, and the remaining board members who looked like passengers on a plane that had just lost both engines. I could not hear Richard's words through the soundproof glass, but I knew the cadence of his speech. He was gesturing with his hands, palms up, the universal sign of a man asking for patience. He was likely spinning a narrative about market volatility, about unexpected supply chain shocks, about how the recent personnel changes, meaning me, had caused a temporary disruption that he was personally rectifying. He was blaming the storm, hoping no one noticed he had sold the umbrella. "Ready?" Marcus asked, adjusting his silk tie. "Ready," I said. Marcus pushed the heavy double doors open. The conversation inside died instantly. Richard stopped mid-sentence, his hand frozen in the air. Every head turned. They watched us walk in, not with the hesitation of intruders, but with the steady, rhythmic pace of executioners. I walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, facing my father. I did not sit down. I placed my leather portfolio on the table. "Piper," Richard said, his voice straining for authority but cracking around the edges. "This is a closed session for shareholders and board members. We are discussing sensitive governance issues." "I know," I said, my voice calm and carrying clearly to the back of the room. "That is why I am here." "You are a visitor," Richard said, looking at the security guard who had hesitated to stop us. "You do not have a seat at this table anymore." "I do not need a seat, Richard," I replied. "I own the table." Marcus stepped forward and began to distribute a stack of documents to the board members. He slid them across the polished wood with the precision of a blackjack dealer. "Gentlemen, and Ms. Evans," Marcus said, "you are looking at a certified copy of the Thomas Family Trust Amendment, dated 2010. Specifically, I draw your attention to Section 12, Subsection B." I watched the board members pick up the papers. I saw Elias, the venture capitalist who had been calling for Richard's resignation all week, adjust his glasses. He read the paragraph. His eyes widened. He looked up at me, then at Richard, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "What is this?" Richard demanded, snatching a copy from the pile. He squinted at the text. "Clause 12B? I never signed this." "You did. Actually," I said, "you signed it the day you took over from grandfather. You were so eager to get the voting rights for the merger that you didn't read the fine print Mom added." "Mom?" Richard whispered. "She knew," I said softly. "She knew that one day you would sacrifice the company for your ego. She created a failsafe." I looked around the room. According to this covenant, my constructive dismissal 10 days ago triggered a reclassification of my unvested equity. I explained. For the next 80 days, my 5% stake carries a super voting weight of 10-1. There was a gasp from the director of HR. "That gives her—" Elias did the mental math quickly. "That gives her 50% of the voting power in this room. 51%, counting the shares I purchased on the open market this morning." I corrected him. Richard stood up. He looked like a man who had been shot, but hadn't felt the pain yet. "You can't do this," he stammered. This is a hostile takeover." "It is not hostile, Richard," I said coldly. "It is corrective, and it is not a takeover. I don't want the company. I just want to ensure it survives you." I turned to the board. "I am calling for an immediate motion to restructure the executive governance of Thomas Ridge Holdings," I announced. "Seconded," Elias shouted, almost jumping out of his chair. Richard looked around the room, panic wild in his eyes. "You cannot vote on this. I am the chairman. I control the agenda." "Not anymore," Marcus said smoothly. "Under the bylaws, a majority shareholder can amend the agenda at any time, and right now, Ms. Thomas is the majority." I looked at my father. He looked small. The power he had wielded over me for 33 years, the power to give approval, the power to withhold love, the power to make me feel small, evaporated. It wasn't taken by force. It was dissolved by the sunlight of legal reality. I proposed the following resolution. I said, reading from my notes. First, the immediate and permanent removal of Lila Thomas from any and all roles within the company, paid or unpaid. She is to be barred from the premises and restricted from contacting clients. Richard flinched. "She is already fired." "Piper." "Fired is temporary with you," I said. "This is a permanent ban. Do I have a vote?" "Aye," Elias said. "Aye," said the others, one by one. I raised my hand. With my super votes, the motion carried instantly. Second, I continued, the role of Chief Executive Officer is to be vacated immediately. Richard Thomas will be transitioned to the role of Chairman Emeritus, a non-executive position with no voting rights and no operational authority. "No!" Richard shouted. He slammed his fist on the table. "This is my company. I built this, you ungrateful child. I gave you life." "You gave me a job description," I countered, "and then you fired me for doing it." I looked at the board members. They were not looking at Richard. They were looking at the future of their investments. They knew he was the anchor dragging them down. "Do I have a vote?" I asked. There was a moment of hesitation. Then, Arthur, the general counsel, the man who had served Richard for 20 years, raised his hand. "Aye," Arthur said softly. "It is time. Richard." The rest of the hands went up. Richard sank back into his chair. He covered his face with his hands. It was over. The reign of the Thomas patriarch was finished, ended not by a competitor, but by the daughter he had underestimated. Third, I said, my voice unwavering, the appointment of Benjamin Davis as interim CEO, effective immediately, pending a full external search. Aye. The room echoed. I closed my portfolio. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was clean. It was the silence of a fever breaking. I looked at Richard one last time. He was staring at the table, at the document his wife had written 14 years ago. He was weeping silently. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You could have just walked away. You were free. Why come back just to do this?" I thought about the morning in the conference room. I thought about the way he had looked at me when I told him the truth about the steel shipment, and how he had chosen Lila's fantasy over my reality. I thought about the words, "Okay then." At the time, he thought it was surrender. He thought it was me accepting my punishment. He was wrong. I looked him in the eye. "When you suspended me," I said, my voice echoing in the glass room, I said, "Okay then." You thought that meant I was agreeing to your terms. I paused. But I said, "Okay then," because I realized I didn't need your permission to be powerful anymore. I said, I stopped asking for a seat at the table. "Richard, I decided to build my own, and when you build your own table, you get to decide who sits at it." I turned to the board. "Gentlemen, Ms. Evans, the company is yours to save. Ben has the operational roadmap. Good luck." I turned on my heel. I did not wait for applause. I did not wait for an apology. I walked toward the double doors. "Piper!" Richard called out. It was a desperate, lonely sound. "Where are you going?" I stopped. my hand on the brass handle. I looked back over my shoulder. I am going to work. Dad, I said, I have a client meeting at North Bay in an hour. I pushed the doors open and walked out. I heard the heavy wood click shut behind me, sealing the past inside. I walked past the security desk, past the elevator bank, and out into the bright, chaotic, beautiful noise of the city street. I took a deep breath. The air tasted like freedom. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I know family drama can be heavy, but sometimes walking away is the strongest move you can make. I would love to hear from you. Please comment below and tell me where you are listening from today. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoyed Piper's journey, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Lila Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and smash the hype button so we can get this story out to more people who might need to hear it. Stay strong, and see you in the next video.